President Biden said today that he would halt the shipment of U.S. offensive weapons to Israel, which he acknowledged have been used to kill civilians in Gaza, if the country moves forward with a long planned ground invasion of Rafah. Now, this is the first time Biden has threatened to withhold U.S. military aid, and it has been, and this is, I should say, the most direct threat that Biden has made in the 7-month war. Actor and adult film star Stormy Daniels took the witness stand in Donald Trump's New York criminal trial yesterday, testifying under oath about a sexual encounter she says she had with the former president in 2006 and the $130,000 deal for her silence that was struck during the closing days of the 2016 presidential campaign. U.S. District Judge Eileen Cannon has indefinitely postponed former Donald Trump's classified documents trial in Florida, pending the resolution of multiple pretrial issues. And the Boy Scouts of America is changing its name for the first time in its 114-year history. It will now be known as Scouting America. This is a significant shift as the organization emerges from bankruptcy and attempts to become more inclusive. The new organization looks forward to welcoming girls and gay youth. President Joe Biden's reelection campaign announced a $14 million spend across battleground states while launching ads aimed at hitting Donald Trump on health care. And House Republicans today failed to land damaging blows as they questioned public school leaders from 3 politically liberal parts of the country, accusing these liberal leaders of turning a blind eye to what they call an alarming rise in anti-Semitism in classrooms since the October 7th Hamas-led attack. And the University of Virginia and police officials are defending actions that led to the arrest of more than 25 pro-Palestinian protesters on campus grounds over the weekend. Top Republicans, led by Trump, are refusing to commit to accept November's election results with 6 months until voters head to the polls. Now, this is raising concerns that the country could see a repeat of the violent aftermath of Trump's loss 4 years ago. This is the news, and this is Areva Martin in real time, and I'm your host, Areva Martin. This is your one-stop destination for today's trending news, expert analysis, and my unfiltered opinions. This is hour 2 of Areva Martin in real time, and this is the hour where we go deep, where we dig behind those headlines and bring you the stories that have people talking. Today, we're talking about the separation of church and state. Recently, 6 of the 9 Supreme Court justices agreed that a former high school football coach in Bremerton, Washington, his name was Joseph Kennedy, they agreed that he was protected by the First Amendment when he repeatedly prayed in public on the 50-yard line after his team's games, and that the school district was wrong to discipline him after he refused to end the practice of praying on the 50-yard line. Now, while there have always been tensions between the separation of church and state and some public school practices in the U.S., often regarded as the Christmas dilemma, it feels different in this moment. It feels like the Supreme Court is more likely to support those efforts to infuse religion and religious practices in public schools. The Supreme Court's decision protecting this former high school coach was celebrated in some parts of the country as permission to engage in public Christian prayer and practices. Now, non-Christian parents, Jewish parents included, fear that their children will experience more anti-Semitism and other forms of anti-Christian microaggressions, which we know will negatively impact all students. Today, 7 out of 10 Americans identify as Christians. Now, when Christianity is being practiced by teachers or in school districts in places that it might not have been practiced in the past, it makes it harder to see the separation of church and state. And we know there are lots of Christian school leaders, there are lots of Christian thought leaders and Christian legislators that want to see more Christian practices and Christian principles infused into public schools throughout this country. When we come forward, we're going to talk to Professor Stephen Green. He's a professor of history and religious studies at Willamette Law School. He's also the author of a very important book called Separating Church and State, a History. This book was published in 2022. And what he reveals in that book and his research on the separation of church and state are critically important, particularly in this election year, particularly in this year when we see so many Christian leaders trying to indoctrinate children in public schools with their Christian theology. When we come forward, we're going to talk to Professor Green about church and state and separation, the foundation of our democracy, and this current conservative Supreme Court and its views on that separation. Stay with us, KBLA Talk 1580.
You're listening to Areva Martin in real time on KBLA Talk 1580.
Hi, it's Tavis Smiley. First, thank you for your support of KBLA Talk 1580. We deeply appreciate you. So, I get asked all the time, Tavis, when are you going to bring back that State of the Black Union Symposium you used to do? You know the one where you had all those black intellectuals on stage every year and everybody watched all day live on C-SPAN? Yeah, I know the one.
Let's bring them back.
Well, I am pleased to tell you that if you go to KBLA1580.com right now, you can sign up to be in the audience here in Los Angeles when we go back live on C-SPAN with a stage full of black thinkers and influencers for a historic conversation. America has never seen a stage full of black folk talking about the urgency of now. Climate justice, climate equity, climate resilience. It's going down Tuesday, June 18th, 4 to 7 p.m. at the California Science Center in Exposition Park. Admission is free, but you must register at KBLA1580.com. Once we reach capacity, you'll have to watch us on C-SPAN. But if you want to be in the room when we go live from Los Angeles, Tuesday, June 18th, head to KBLA1580.com right now to reserve your seat. Caring about the climate, caring about the community. With KBLA Talk 1580, we've got your black.
I believe up there. Hey!
Are you wet shaving? You'll get razor bumps.
Nah, Pops, I'm good with Gillette Skin Guard. How long you been growing that beard mama hates anyway?
Since 77, I shaved and got ingrown so bad.
That's why I use the Gillette Skin Guard razor, face scrub, shave gel, and moisturizer. So I don't have to worry about new razor bumps or shaving irritation.
Gillette Skin Guard, huh? Your mama's gonna love this one.
The best a man can get keeps getting better with Gillette Skin Guard. Buy now at a retailer near you.
We're with Bridget, whose husband won't be home for months, and whose daughter is due any day. We're with Mike, who's leaving home to protect his family and yours. We're with all service members and their families who need community, connection, and maybe a bit of magic. Are you with them? Learn more at uso.org today.
The possibility of lung cancer can be pretty scary, especially if you're one of approximately 8 million current or former smokers at high risk. That's why SaveByTheScan.org wants you to know that now there's a breakthrough low-dose CT scan that can detect lung cancer early, and it only takes 60 seconds. You stop smoking, now start screening. For an easy quiz to see if you're eligible, visit SaveByTheScan.org. It could save your life. SaveByTheScan.org is brought to you by the American Lung Association's Lung Force Initiative and the Ad Council.
We are back, and in this hour, we are talking about prayer in schools. We're talking about the separation of church and state. There is a landmark case called Engel versus Vitale. It was decided by the Supreme Court in 1962. And in this case, the Supreme Court ruled that school-sponsored prayer in public schools violate the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, breaching the constitutional wall of separation between church and state. This debate has been this 1962 case, I should say, didn't end the debate about the role of prayer in public schools. On April 25th, just a year or two ago, the Supreme Court heard arguments in that case I mentioned earlier. That's the case of Joseph Kennedy, a football coach at a public high school in Washington state, who was told by the school board that he could no longer offer prayers on the 50-yard line uh, after games. And in fact, he was disciplined for continuing to offer prayers during his football games. And the Supreme Court, this case, Joseph uh, Kennedy actually filed a lawsuit against the school because of the disciplinary action. The case made its way all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, this current makeup of our Supreme Court, they ruled not consistent with their previous decision in Engel versus Vitality, but they actually ruled in favor of Joseph Kennedy. I'm going to give you some of the facts about that case. Joseph used to be an assistant coach for a high school football team near Seattle. He pointed to the spot on the 50-yard line where he would take a knee and offer prayers after games. He was wearing a Bremerton Knights jacket and squinting in the drizzling morning rain, and he repeated a promise he had made to God when he became a coach. He said, "I will give you the glory after every game, win or lose," adding, "It just made sense to do it on the field of battle." He said coaching was his calling, but after the school board told him to stop mixing football and faith on the field, he left the job and sued, with the lower court rejecting his argument that the board had violated his First Amendment rights. The Supreme Court decided this was an important case and they were going to take this case up. And one would have thought and expected that the Supreme Court would rule against Mr. Kennedy, but in a surprise and in turn of events, the school board actually, or the U.S. Supreme Court, actually ruled that his First Amendment, that is Joseph Kennedy's First Amendment rights, had in fact been violated. And we now have seen lots of religious leaders, lots of conservative religious leaders take advantage of this ruling to use it as a way to introduce prayer and introduce more religious practices into schools. And some families may say, well, what does it matter? You know, we say the Pledge of Allegiance. We can give kids the option if they don't want to participate in prayer, not to participate. They can sit it out. But it does matter. It does matter. If you've ever been in an environment where everyone is doing something and you're the only one not doing it, say you're in kindergarten or first grade, you can imagine the pressure that someone might feel to participate in that kind of practice. And you could also imagine the kind of pressure that students and teachers will feel if they are in an environment where there is a particular Christian theology that's being imposed in their educational process. Professor Stephen Green is a professor of history and religious studies at Willamette University. He's written a very important book called Separating Church and State, a History, published in 2022. Thank you so much, Professor Green, for joining me in this hour. I know this is an area of expertise for you. You've done a lot of research. You've done a lot of writing on this area. Help us understand how the court, in that case involving that football coach in Bremerton, Washington, how they determined that his First Amendment rights had been violated in light of this 1962 Supreme Court case, where the court pretty clearly stated that prayer in public schools violates the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Oh, I think you're still muted, Professor Green. We're having some technical difficulties. We're going to take a little break and let Professor Green work on his technology. When we come forward, we're going to talk to Professor Stephen Green about the separation of church and state. I'm not sure we have Professor Green. We're still trying to get his. Yeah, he's trying to work on his technology. We have our technicians working with him, trying to get his technology working so we can hear what he has to say about this very important issue of separation of church and state. All right. We're going to keep working on Professor Green's technology. We're going to keep talking about this issue of separation of church and state. Again, like I said, some families feel like they have an obligation to use public schools as the vehicle through which they teach a religion. I actually went to an all-girls Catholic school myself. So, but it was a choice. It was a choice that my parents made to have me in a Catholic school, not a public school. So when you make the choice to go to a religious school, then you know what you're getting. But when you put your kid and you enroll in a public school, the notion that any particular religious practice is going to be implemented in that school, I think can be very overwhelming and concerning, as it should be to parents. And we know in that landmark case of Engel versus Vitale in 1962, the Supreme Court ruled that school-sponsored prayer in public schools violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Said it breached the constitutional wall of separation between church and state. But since that ruling in 1962, there's been a lot of debate about prayer in public and state-financed schools. The Supreme Court heard this decision involving this former football coach, Joseph Kennedy, who said he had made a commitment to God, that if he won certain games, he was going to give God praise. He was going to acknowledge him. And he thought the best place to do that, he said, was on the battlefield, to do it right on that football field. So he would take a knee, and pray to God. And the school says, you can't do that. This is a public school. You can't stop in the middle of a field in the midst of a football game and start praying. Jewish parents, in particular, are concerned about Christianity being Christian practices, Christian religion being introduced in public schools. They believe it leads to anti-Semitism and creates a hostile environment for non-Christians. Now, the reality is 7 out of 10 Americans happen to be Christians and identify with Christianity, but that's not 10 out of 10. And even those that identify as Christians in this country aren't necessarily in favor of or supportive of having prayer in schools, because they know the kinds of problems, the kinds of issues that it can create in a school environment. I'm just thinking about all the different denominations. So Christianity is this great big umbrella, and folks who call themselves Christian come in all denominations. You have Protestants, you have Lutherans, you have Methodists, you have Catholics, but they all have very different ways that they practice their Christianity. They all read the Bible and have different interpretations of the Bible. They all have different practices. And so when you talk about having Christianity or prayer being introduced in public school, what if that prayer, what if that practice is inconsistent with your theology as a Christian? You may be a Christian, like being a Catholic. Catholics don't believe that part of the Catholicism is not having women as priests, not having priests be allowed to get married and to have families. But if you are, let's say, a Protestant, a member of a Protestant denomination, you may have religious leaders, priests, who are actually married, who have families, and who have a very different approach to, again, how they read, interpret the Bible, what their traditions are. And that's the problem. So you got 4 or 5 different denominations. You have all of these denominations who are going to be competing. And then let's talk about the Christian right. We know that in this country, the Christian right, some, not all, but some are heavily identified with white supremacy and white supremacists. And is it just going to be an innocuous prayer that's introduced in schools, or is it something more nefarious? Is it, some of the principles, some of the beliefs of white supremacists, those people who believe that white people are genetically superior, that people of color are genetically inferior to those who are uh, not who are not white. I think we've gotten Professor Green's technology worked out. Are you with us, Professor Green? Are you with us, Professor Green? Yeah, Robert, technology. We're still having some issues with Professor Green's technology. We're working as diligently as we can to work out and this is an unusual problem, but really grateful to my technology team, to the production team that's working to get Professor Green up and rolling. We're talking in this hour about separation of church and state and some pretty significant Supreme Court decisions that in some ways contradict each other. Going back to 1962, the Supreme Court making it very clear that there is no place for Christianity, prayer in public schools, and then a more recent case involving a former high school football coach, Joseph Kennedy, who actually left a high school because he was disciplined for praying on the football field. The Supreme Court taking a very different approach in that case, saying that he had a First Amendment right. And that's the argument that comes up very frequently in these cases is, what about the First Amendment right of students? What about those that want to pray and those that want to engage in certain religious practices in their school setting? Is allowing them to do that in any way impeding on the First Amendment rights of those other students? Because yes, all of us have First Amendment rights, but it's just a matter of how do we balance those rights. And although clearly this Joseph Kennedy had a right to pray, to worship, to thank God, but to do so in a school setting, to do so during a game, a school sanctioned, a school sponsored game, was the issue. And there are lots of folks, again, those that are Christians that don't believe that even someone as well intentioned and well meaning as this former football coach should be allowed to practice religion uh, in a public school setting. Very interesting because, again, parents are deeply divided on this. Some of it is on, political. It follows some of the political division that we see in this country, and you see in southern states in particular, and you see amongst GOP legislators and leaders in southern states more support for, more endorsements of, more willingness to allow public schools in those states to introduce religion and to allow prayer and to allow other Christian practices, because it's not just prayer. I mean, you think about the slippery slope. So opening the door for prayer, then you start talking about curriculum. What if all the stories in the book are no longer about, Betty and Bob, but now they're about Mary and Joseph? They're about biblical figures. What if teachers are now teaching the Ten Commandments? What if teachers are using scriptures to teach lessons, to talk to students, to engage with students? That would be in many ways disastrous, again, because everybody's theology is different. Everybody's approach to religion is different. And you don't want, I believe, and that's why we have separation of church and state in our Constitution. You do not want people's individual religious beliefs influencing, academic curriculum, the way schools implement their curriculum, the way they develop their curriculum. So it's a huge problem, which is something that we have seen Jewish families in particular saying they're also concerned about the rise in anti-Semitism. If Jewish students have to be exposed to Christian practices, if Jewish students have to sit in classrooms where issues of Christianity or Christian practices are being implemented. So lots of ancillary, I'll call them, consequences associated with allowing schools, particularly schools where we've seen so much activism on the part of parents. We've seen parents who don't want kids to learn about the LGBTQ community. So imagine again, if your theology says that gay people are somehow committing sins just by the virtue of being gay. Those issues and more, we're going to continue this conversation about the separation of church and state when we come forward, right here on KBLA Talk 1580. Stay with us.
Time. More of Areva Martin in real time when we come forward.
I'm Amber Payton. Here's the latest on the Black Information Network. African-American New York City Mayor Eric Adams believes Rikers Island can handle Donald Trump if he faces jail time for violating a gag order in his hush money criminal trial. The judge in the case has continuously threatened the former president with jail time if he keeps violating the gag order that's been implemented since the start of the trial. Justice Juan Merchant has fined Trump $10,000 for social media and campaign site posts. Baltimore Mayor Brandon Scott has released a statement following the recovery of the sixth worker killed in the collapse of the Key Bridge. The mayor, who is Black, says it is impossible to overstate how important it is that each of the Marylanders have been brought home to their families and the small amount of peace and closure it brings to them. He says nothing will fully overcome the pain of their loss, but he is deeply grateful for the entire Unified Command and the salvage teams for never losing focus on the importance of recovering the victims. That's the latest. I'm Amber Payton on your home for 24/7 News, the Black Information Network.
Over in Elysian Park, expect stop traffic over 20 minutes on the 110 South between Stadium Way and the 10. A crash in mid-city involving a motorcycle and car is currently in the left lane. The 10 east before La Cienega Boulevard.
We are back, and in this hour, we are talking about the separation of church and state. We have Professor Stephen Green. He's a professor of history and religious studies at Willamette University. He's written a very important book called Separating Church and State. We've been having some issues with Professor Green's mic that our technical team has been working through, so I hope to have him join our conversation as they work through that technical issue. But I want to go back to a story that I talked about earlier in the show today, and that was those Republican-led House committee hearings that have been taking place over the last couple of months. That's led by Virginia Fox. She heads the GOP Education Committee. She's been inviting college professors to testify about what she and her GOP colleagues call this alarming rise in anti-Semitism. Now, you would think that if the education committee is inviting or summoning these university presidents to the Hill, that they're doing so in good faith, and that they really have a desire to work through issues that may be arising on college campuses. We've seen protests erupt throughout the last several weeks. We've seen students be arrested. We've seen faculty members be arrested as well. And presumably the GOP leaders are trying to address this issue, provide some solutions. But what we've seen, dating back a couple of months when Claudine Gay, president of Harvard University, was there, it really wasn't about helping the professors. It wasn't about helping the students or the universities. It was about gotcha moments. It was about getting some viral video moment and giving these GOP leaders a platform that they could use to exploit. We know Elise Stefanik, a congressional member from New York, a staunch Republican, is auditioning to be the vice president along with Donald Trump on the Republican ticket. And so she's been one of the toughest leaders who have been drilling these university leaders. When former Harvard professor Gay was on the Hill, we know that Elise Stefanik, who is a Harvard graduate herself, was incredibly harsh on Professor Gay. Many people criticized Professor Gay, saying that she wasn't prepared for the hearing, that she gave non-committal responses, and that she pretty much bombed. I mean, that was the conclusion of many. Others, like myself, thought she was set up and that her team around her, the team at Harvard University, my alma mater, did not do a good job preparing her to appear before those hearings. And as a result, her performance was less than stellar, and not because she's not a brilliant scholar herself, but because the environment in which she was called to participate in was already gunning for her. It wasn't, like I said, a fair fight. They knew what they wanted the outcome to be, and they wanted the outcome to be public shame and humiliation for Dr. Gay. And they wanted to oust her. And eventually they were, even though Harvard's trustee board initially stood in solidarity with Professor Gay or President Gay. Eventually they caved to the Republican pressure and she was ousted. And we've just seen a stream of other college presidents be marched into the Capitol to have to testify before this committee, only to find themselves equally frustrated, equally humiliated, intimidated in some ways by these GOP leaders. And I submit that it's because of the poor handling of these hearings by university professors that we've seen some of the violence on campus over the Israeli-Gaza war, the Palestinian war, and not because the students have been in any way violent. The fact that these universities have not been prepared, the fact that they hadn't thought through what is likely to happen on student protests, the fact that they don't know historically student protest is a big part of the fabric of this country. It's the way we've moved the needle on so many things in this country, from the Vietnam War to ending apartheid in South Africa. So when the news broke today, or when the hearings happened today, before this very same, what I'll call hostile GOP committee, and unlike the university presidents today, there were presidents of secondary schools. These are high schools. These are the men and women that lead high schools. And again, very contentious 2-hour hearing. Again, Republicans accusing these school leaders, leaders from New York City, from Berkeley, California, and Montgomery County, Maryland, accusing them of turning a blind eye to anti-Semitism. Now, in some ways, this is so hypocritical. It's comical. These are white leaders, some Jewish, some not, but all professing to be so concerned about anti-Semitism on campus. Folks that we haven't previously seen take such a public stand in support of Jewish students on college campuses, people who we've not seen take a similar approach to Muslim students on campus, and we definitely have not seen these people take that kind of stand as it relates to Black students on campus. Some of the folks who testified today, the superintendent of the Berkeley school, she acknowledged that there were incidents on her school's campus, but stated that anti-Semitism is not pervasive in the Berkeley Unified School District. See, these GOP leaders have painted with a very broad brush. They've repeated these talking points that anti-Semitism is pervasive and running rampant on school campuses across this country. And this superintendent fought back. She said, that's just not true. Also, David Banks, he's the New York City Schools chancellor. He said repeatedly, hostile questions from the panel suggested that it was trying to elicit, as I've said, this gotcha moment rather than solve the problem of anti-Semitism. I love this brother, Professor or Dr. David Banks, or Superintendent, I guess he's Chancellor David Banks of the New York School District. He was so prepared. He was so not there for the nonsense. He was so not going to let these GOP leaders have their gotcha moment. He was not going to let them talk him down. He was not going to let them humiliate him. He said, we cannot simply discipline our way out of this problem. The true antidote to ignorance and bias, he said, is to teach. And he would not, like I said, kowtow the way we saw Columbia University's president do. He would not waver the way we see the former president of Harvard University do, what we saw her do when she was testifying. And as a result, these Republicans, these lawmakers did not elicit the kind of damaging moments, the kind of viral moments that they were hoping for. And nor did the school leaders' answers appear to prompt the kind of widespread anger that happened again when you saw these university presidents, like the president of Columbia, testify. While she was testifying in Congress, protesters were setting up shop on Columbia's campus. And they were, in many ways, the leaders. They became the epicenter of the protests. And the hearing held by the subcommittee with an inexperienced chair, featuring this cameo by, again, Elise Stefanik of New York, who has been leading the sharpest questioning of the university presidents. It just came off flat. It simply flat. The school leaders were prepared, and the same questions that seemed to trip up the Harvard and Penn presidents didn't faze these school leaders, these secondary school leaders. When we come forward, we're going to talk more about how school leaders are fighting back and not allowing the GOP to control the narrative. Stay with us, KBLA Talk 1580.
You're listening to Areva Martin in real time on KBLA Talk 1580.
We ask seniors how to prevent Medicare scams.
My best advice, if you get a phone call, do not talk to the person. These people are well trained. Don't talk to them.
They don't know me. They're just trying to scam me.
Don't be fooled. Hang up. Just hang up.
Never give out your Medicare number.
They're going to get your number to put in a false claim.
If I get a call from someone, I don't pick up the phone. And should I pick up the phone and they ask for information, then I hang up.
How do you detect Medicare fraud?
Just like I check my credit card statements, I check my Medicare statements monthly.
Scammers can get a hold of your number, order medical devices through your account, and you're not even going to know about it if you don't look at your statement.
Check your statement every month.
If you get your statement and you see something that you know you did not have done, you report it.
Call your senior Medicare Patrol.
To report Medicare fraud, call the Senior Medicare Patrol at 855-613-7080.
Tips to help improve your credit score in 2024. Establishing credit is an important key to achieving financial health, but building a credit history from scratch can feel challenging since you need credit to build credit. First, what does it mean to build credit? All consumers have a score between 300 and 850. You want your score to be as high as possible as lenders look at your credit score to make loan and credit decisions. A good credit score shows you have a track record of borrowing money responsibly. Remember, it's never too late to build or rebuild your credit. This segment is sponsored by JP Morgan Chase & Company.
KBLA Talk 1580. We've got a lot to talk about.
KBLA Talk 1580 believes in community empowerment. LA's 99 neighborhood councils form the grassroots level of the Los Angeles city government. The system was created to connect LA's diverse communities to City Hall. While neighborhood council board members are volunteers, they are also public officials elected to office by the members of their community. Neighborhood councils advocate on issues like homelessness, housing, land use, emergency preparedness, public safety, parks, transportation, and sustainability. They also provide local expertise on the delivery of city services to their various communities. Neighborhood councils are open to participation by anyone who is a part of the fabric of daily life in said community. This includes those who live, work, or own property or a business. If you are interested in stepping up to join your local neighborhood council, visit www.empowerla.org. That's empowerla.org. It's time to think globally, but act locally. This is a community call to action from KBLA Talk 1580.
We are back, and we've been talking in this half of the show about this hearing that took place on Capitol Hill. GOP lawmakers thinking they were going to get a got you moment out of these secondary school leaders, accusing them of allowing anti-Semitism to run rampant on their school campuses. But what they got was a rude awakening meaning that these secondary school leaders didn't kowtow to them in the way that university presidents did. When Representative Aaron Bean of Florida, the first-term Republican who led the hearing, opened with a series of rapid-fire questions. Does Israel have the right to exist as a Jewish state? Was the October 7th Hamas attack an act of terrorism? The school leaders, they didn't shrink. They didn't flinch. They said yes and no to those questions. They gave short, affirmative answers. The congressman then had to move on, saying he had to boogie to get through the hearing. Now, I don't know what that means, but I think it means he didn't get the answers he wanted. And throughout, the district leaders were quick to condemn anti-Semitism and said that they had addressed it on their campuses. They gave specific incidents of disciplinary measures and new teaching guidelines to combat hate. Mr. Banks said that the New York School District had removed or disciplined or was in the process of disciplining at least a dozen staff members and school leaders, including removing a principal in the middle of the school year. He said the district had also suspended 30 students who had been involved when hate crimes were committed, and that they had retained all 1,600 principals on the disciplinary code. So, but despite giving all of those examples of everything he had done, Republicans still accused him of not taking strong enough action. Now, in one or more of these heated exchanges, Representative Brandon Williams, a Republican of New York, grilled Mr. Banks about an incident that happened last fall at a school called Hillcrest High in Queens. Officials said that students led a raucous demonstration against a pro-Israel teacher. Now, the education department removed Hillcrest's principal in December, and under questioning from this Congressman Williams, Mr. Banks acknowledged that the principal was still on the city's payroll. How can Jewish students feel safe in New York City public schools when you can't even terminate the principal of Open Season on Jews High School? Get that, Open Season on Jews High School. That's what this congressman said. Now, Mr. Banks, who graduated from Hillcrest in the 1970s, responded very quickly and very tersely It's not open season on Jews High School. It's called Hillcrest High School, he said. That's the name of the school. And at that school, we consider his leadership not strong enough to be the leader in that school. So he wasn't having it. And question again about why the Hillcrest principal had not been fired, Mr. Banks said that every employee in the school system has due process rights. Hello, due process rights. Later, Elise Stefanik tried to force Banks to acknowledge that the principal was still employed. In Banks' words, on one of the teams under one of our deputy chancellors. Stefanik also asked Banks about a New York City teacher who posted about Hamas on social media. Banks called the teacher's posting disgusting, but refused to say what disciplinary action had been taken, if any. Stefanik complained that Banks and other school leaders were paying lip service to the issue of anti-Semitism and that there was a lack of enforcement and a lack of accountability. And what's always troubling to me about these hearings, they take one example. One teacher posts something favorable about Hamas, one incident, and they try to paint with this broad brush that means there's anti-Semitism that's rampant on the campus. But Mr. Banks, again, this is the chancellor of the New York school districts. He rejected the accusations. Overall, he said New York City school system has recorded more than 280 incidents since October 7. He says only 40% have been anti-Semitic. He said another 30% were Islamophobic. He said that while the district can't prevent every incident, school leaders were doing their best. And I'm so glad he pointed out that 30% were Islamophobic, because this debate can sometimes feel so one-sided. Yes, anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic hate is disgusting, it's abhorrent, and should be rooted out wherever it exists. But that's the same for anti-Blackness. That's the same for racism against Black people. It's the same for racism, or anti-Islamic, for those who discriminate and hate people just because they are Muslim. Those are examples of hate as well. And we can't have this discussion and just have these Republican lawmakers only interested in what's happening as it relates to anti-Semitism. What about all the other students on these campuses? What about the Black students that are now feeling so incredibly overwhelmed, nervous and anxious because police are occupying their schools? My daughter told me today, she's a student at Columbia. She was trying to make her way to a medical appointment, and some very rude police officer on the campus stopped her, questioned her about her belonging on that campus, even though she is a third-year law student, has been there for 3 years. So let's talk about how other students are being treated. Yes, we should protect Jewish students, but don't Black students have a right to be protected? Don't Muslim students have a right to be protected? Should Black students who know the history of violence against them by police have to go to school on campuses where they are, intimidated by and questioned by police officers? Is Elise Stefanik, is Virginia Foxx, or any of these GOP leaders calling to, the Capitol, forcing these school leaders to come to the campus to defend how they are protecting other students? I don't think so. We haven't seen that. So no wonder that Mr. Banks, as chancellor of New York schools, came prepared to fight back, came with facts, not one incident that gets blown up into, a systemic problem. Yes, one teacher posting does not mean that the school has a policy of condoning anti-Semitism. He being Mr. Banks, pointed to an incident at a Brooklyn grade school where a map of North Africa and the Middle East did not include Israel, labeling it Palestine. Mr. Banks said that, to me, that's anti-Semitic. But he also pushed back on calls to fire the teacher, saying she acknowledged that she made a mistake. The teacher, who identified herself as a Palestinian American, said in an email that she felt abandoned and unprotected by the city's education department after news of the classroom map drew backlash on social media. Again, there are Palestinian Americans whose family members have been killed. 33,000 people have been killed. So what about how they are feeling in this moment, how unsafe they feel? Another superintendent from one of the Berkeley campuses said Jewish students in her district has shared painful stories about anti-Semitism, but she refused to say whether any teachers had been fired. In response, under questioning from a Republican from California, she acknowledged that a group known as Liberated Ethnic Studies was a thought partner of the district, that group has put forth sample teaching materials that portray Israel as a settler colonial entity and are strongly critical of the country. Now, we've had this conversation before. Can you be critical of Israel and not be anti-Semitic? And Dr. David Eichard, who I turn to frequently on this show, who's a professor at Vanderbilt University, says absolutely yes, that you can criticize the government of Israel, you can criticize Benjamin Netanyahu, and it doesn't make you anti-Semitic. He talks about how these issues have been conflated, and now even questioning the killing of 33,000 people by Benjamin Netanyahu gets someone painted as anti-Semitic. He says that's absolutely positively ridiculous, and that we can criticize government action. Just like in America, we can criticize the government, we can criticize Joe Biden all day long. Doesn't make us anti-American. We are taught to be critical of governments. We are taught to be critical thinkers. We don't have to all agree with Benjamin Netanyahu's plan. Joe Biden doesn't agree with it. He's saying he's going to withhold military aid or offensive weapons from Israel if they invade Rafah. Does that make Joe Biden anti-Semitic because he is saying, Benjamin Netanyahu, I don't agree with your military policies. I don't agree with the planned offensive military strike? No, it doesn't make him anti-Semitic. You can't dismiss how he has stood up for Jewish people. You can't dismiss how he has, made it very clear that there's no room in this country for anti-Semitic hate. But it doesn't mean that he has to agree with everything Benjamin Netanyahu has to do and that he has to keep supplying military aid and arms to him. We've got to be real clear about what anti-Semitism is and what it isn't. And we have to make sure that we are working to eliminate all hate on school campuses, because I don't want my Black kids going to school where they feel that they are surrounded by anti-Blackness, or that racist slurs or racist comments are allowed to flourish on those campuses. And I don't want that to happen for Jewish students either, but nor do I want it to happen for Muslim students. I don't want it to happen for gay students. All students should be able to go to schools, whether it's an elementary school, a secondary school, or a college or university, and feel safe. And they should also be able to explore. They should also be able to question, to challenge, and to express what they are feeling, because that's what we teach our kids to do, is to be critical thinkers and to challenge anything that they feel does not support their principles and their values. So again, kudos to those secondary school leaders who stood up to the GOP mob and they won. We're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us for Areva Martin in Real Time today. The next voice that you hear will be Robin Ayers and the Raw Report right here on